Hey guys, welcome to the Wedding Vendors Happy Hour with your hosts, Derek and Jade.
What's up, guys? Thanks for tuning in and welcome to episode number 10 of the Wedding Vendors Happy Hour. Again, my name is Derek with DP Films Productions.
My name is Jade with Justice Promised Events. Today we are super excited to chat with Rob Schenk, a lawyer who specializes in the wedding industry.
That's right. Today he shares a ton of info about wedding industry law. This is going to be an amazing episode as we chat about how to protect your business legally. So grab a drink, take a seat, and let's get to it. Hey, how's it going, Rob? Thanks for being a part of our show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you're based out of, I look like Atlanta?
Yeah, that's where I'm physically located. But I am licensed to practice and take clients in 5 different states: in California, Georgia, Florida, New York, and Tennessee. Yes, that's all. Yeah, that's all. That's right.
Awesome.
That's awesome. I got to ask, with everything going on right now, how's your quarantine life?
Well, it's kind of strange, but I work from home anyway, and my wife and I are homebodies. So the thing that's affected us the most is going to the gym. That's the main thing, because I eat 90% of my meals from home too. I'm basically some type of like Obi-Wan Kenobi recluse in my hut, never going out except for that. But so it's kind of like it's a delayed thing. So like maybe 5 weeks into this, okay, I really want to go to Taco Bell right now. But I can't, so.
No kidding. Yeah, I know. With this, when the quarantine life thing started to happen, we're like, oh, that's what we call our lifestyle. After it really picked up. With wedding vendors, we just like edit at home all the time. And then they're just like, oh, you guys have to stay home. We're like, oh, we've been doing that. It's kind of funny.
Exactly.
So to kick this show off, can you just tell the listeners, who you are, what you do, and how long you've been doing it?
Sure. So my name is Rob Schenk. I am an attorney. A portion of my law practice is dedicated to representing wedding and event industry professionals in contract matters. So drafting contracts, reviewing contracts, keeping the business legit in the states that I had just mentioned. I also have a podcast dealing with wedding industry law issues. The podcast is called Wedding Industry Law, the Wedding Industry Law Podcast. And then I also have as another venture for those individuals that would like contracts but aren't in the states that I mentioned or work in, but it's a company called WedForms, WEDFORMZ.com, where people can get wedding and event-based contracts, templates for their particular states. So that keeps me busy.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, I bet you that keeps you busy a lot. You probably get a lot of people asking about contract advice and stuff. I know we'll probably reach out to you about that now that this whole pandemic kind of made everything a scramble.
Definitely.
Sure thing. Yeah, I understand.
So how did you get into wedding law, like specializing in wedding industry law?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. So about 10 years ago or so, I dated a wedding photographer and looked at her contract. And I came from a business law background, so I kind of understood contract terms from, a business legal sense, but I didn't have a lot of experience in the event industry. And so that was kind of my step into the door of the wedding and event industry was reviewing her contract and adjusting that contract, and then actually learning her industry with, the photography industry, getting an understanding of how that industry works. And that just kind of blossomed into working with other wedding vendors through the years. So, I got on the speaking tour, began representing more and more folks, sometimes in litigation. So that kind of informed my practice, and that's how I kind of was able to grow kind of a speciality with the wedding and event crowd. Because I kind of learned the parlance, learned, how things work.
That's super cool. That's really cool. So I know you kind of briefly went over the services you kind of offer, but can you go a little bit more in depth about, exactly what you do for your services?
Sure. So, it just depends on what people need. So most of the time, an overwhelming majority of the work that I do with clients is producing documents that they need to interact with clients and other vendors or employees. Even within that category, most of what I do is drafting the contract. So, for example, a DJ or a videographer, the contract that DJ or the videographer uses with the client that lays out the terms of the engagement, that lays out the terms and scope of the services that are provided. The laws is there are going to be a lot of things that are quote unquote legal requirements that would need to be in those documents to really fully protect the DJ and the videographer. So the contract between the professional and the client. And then I also do a lot of work with regards to the DJ if they have staff or if they have independent contractors. I help develop the contracts between the principal DJ and then whatever assistants or independent contractors that they have. On a kind of like a smaller scale, not as much as I used to, but sometimes I can fire off the evil letter or demand letter, cease and desist letter on behalf of a wedding professional to a client that maybe hasn't paid or is threatening something along those lines, settling disputes. And then within that category, I do a little bit of dispute resolution. So attempting, if something has gone wrong between the wedding professional and the client, drafting the document that sets forth the arrangements that everybody will lead each other along. So that's like 99% of what I do. I very rarely litigate these issues anymore because as I found out through the first few years of practice that it's very rare that it is worth the time and money to litigate anything within the wedding industry. It really is. And that's the case with pretty much any business litigation. Eventually, one side is going to run out of money because the process is extremely expensive, extremely consuming.
No kidding. And I liked how you mentioned about, so if a client doesn't pay, you kind of send them a letter and kind of go after it. Have you ever had to deal with that? You've had to deal with that before? And how long does a vendor usually wait until they actually have you go after the client?
It runs the gamut. There's some, again, I guess it depends on the personality of the vendor. So you've got some vendors that, they might be threatened with something from a client and get 14 days to respond, and they'll call me on the 14th day. Like, Rob, can you help me? Or, vice versa. But typically when you're dealing with a situation like that, it's probably gone on back and forth for a few days or at least a few correspondences back and forth. And then it has escalated to somebody starting to get a lawyer. And that's when they, or the other side's starting to get a lawyer. That's when they call me. But like I said, it's easy for me to say as a lawyer, but typically you can really finagle down the issues and controversy pretty simply and try to get a resolution pretty quickly if you've done this a few times. And that's pretty much how it works. Is most of the time when you're dealing with an issue of the client says that you didn't deliver the services that you agreed to, or maybe they don't think they should owe you as much as they should. And then you've got the client on the other side saying, well, that might be true, but you're threatening to flame me on the internet or whatever. And, so they want their reputation protected. They want confidentiality. They want the covenant not to sue. And so it's easy to be like, okay, well, in exchange for X amount of refund or whatever, we can all agree that, you're not going to do bad reviews. You're not going to flame me. You're not going to sue me, this kind of thing. And, it can be really down to one document that everybody can agree on. It's not super simple, but, if you've done this a few times, it can be, you've seen what's going on.
Yeah. That's cool. But not that situation if anyone's ever in it. Yeah. So I got to ask.
Well, I always try to say that people should try to I always recommend that, if you think that you've done something wrong or you think that you haven't delivered, own up to it, apologize, and ask what you can do to make it right. Because even if down the road, and people are worried about that because, well, I'm afraid what I can say will be held against me. typically, if you're trying to make amends, that was good down the road. But if, in front of a trial judge, like, well, so this vendor's trying to mitigate, whatever they did wrong, and I think that's always, I recommend first steps. If you think that you might be in the wrong with something, do say, what can I do to make it right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely, I agree. Always try to cool down the situation before it escalates to something far greater, big time. So you mentioned that you were married to a wedding photographer. What? No. Let's see. What was the biggest mistake you've seen that wedding professionals make when it comes to protecting them legally?
Well, just to correct the record, in case my wife is listening to this, this was an ex-girlfriend from 10 years ago, not my current wife. So
oh, okay, sorry about that.
I don't want her to come in here and bust through the door. Yeah. So I think that I'll answer the question, and the answer is, the biggest mistake is not handling the money in the contract. So 99% of the issues that I see with wedding professionals is dealing with money. And I'm talking about out of all the stuff, whether it's, that person's trying to infringe on my trademark, or this person's defaming me, or this person punched me in the face. Like, of everything you can think of that could possibly be a legal issue, 99% of the time it deals with money. And even in that 99%, 95% of it is dealing with what happens to money if the client cancels the event of their own accord. Not talking about pandemics or anything like that. I'm talking about the bride is cheating on the groom and they don't want to get married anymore. What happens to the money in that instance is the number one thing that I see. And so the number one mistake is not laying out point by point what happens to the money that the vendor takes during the duration of the contract that would not go back to the client if the client cancels the event. That has to be, of all of the prime real estate on that paper, on that document, that needs to be the primary driver of why you even have the thing. Because if 99% of the time it's going to be about the money, then that needs to be, 99% of your effort in that document needs to be about the money.
Awesome. So can you go
and the mistake is not doing that.
Gotcha. Yeah. So can you go into a little bit on what should generally be included in that cancellation clause just to protect your own wedding business?
Sure. And again, let me preface this by saying that what I'm going to describe is for clients canceling an event, if the event not going forward, for things that are within the control of the client, that are not your fault, that are not an act of God or a force majeure event. And we can talk about that later. Yeah, so this is literally just, we don't want to get married to each other anymore because we hate each other's guts. That's 95% of the times, that's why the event is going to be canceled. Okay, so now that we've kind of got that as the frame of reference of what we're talking about, then what every wedding industry professional, what every event professional needs to have is a strong liquidated damages clause in their contract. Liquidated damages is the concept in the law that says if the client breaches, in this instance, cancels the event for reasons within their control, the vendor is going to be entitled to X amount of money. So that's the primary thing that you want to be able to have. Now, every state is different with what requirements you need to have in order for the liquidated damages clause to be enforceable. So, for example, you can't make 100% of the contract value a liquidated damages in most states, for example. So typically how wedding and event professionals would create their liquidated damages clause would be to take payments. Sometimes it's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever the case may be, that don't go back to the client if they cancel the event at some point during the duration of the event. A wedding industry professional does not necessarily have to take only that first payment as the quote unquote deposit, as the quote unquote liquidated damages. It can be any payment during the duration of the contract. So that's the first component of it, is just laying out the fact that this, that a payment doesn't go back to the client in X instance. Like, what's the mechanism by which I keep money? Okay. The second part of the liquidated damages clause that's important is explaining in the contract why the money doesn't go back. So there's the misconception that a deposit or money held by the vendor up on until the services are fully rendered can go back to the client if the event is canceled because, hey, it's a day off for you now. Why should I pay you money if you have the day off? Like, this money's just to hold the date. That's a misconception. Most wedding professionals are doing things behind the scenes. You're foregoing other opportunities. So, like, if somebody else calls you, you might not take that job. Okay.
Yep.
You might be having to hire assistants or secondary personnel that are specific to that event. You might be, implementing software, or there might be a lighting display specific to this event that you're doing behind the scenes. And therefore, if the client cancels, you're out, not just that date, you're out all the work that you've done. So that is, explaining that in the contract is just as important as explaining the mechanism for when it does not go back, the money does not go back. And so I kind of I've skipped ahead a little bit, but like, there's a couple ways that, there's many ways, but the primary way that the liquidated damages clause works is that it's you get something at the beginning of the contract, and then you get something down the line later on, like 30 days before, 45 days before, day out, or whatever it is, and then you can also make that one non-refundable. The point of this, really, and forgive me if I keep droning on about this, but like, and you can interrupt me anytime. So the point of this is to kind of spread your risk during the duration of the contract. So, like, if you're accepting a liquidated damage, like a money that's non-refundable, it doesn't go back, like it's 25% of the contract value when you sign. If you take 75% or the balance the day of, you're never going to be able to get that money from them. You could have a liquidated damages clause that says that we can get 50% of the value or 60% of the value or whatever, but if you don't have it in your hand, liquidated damages are worth it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. So the final point of the liquidated damages is that it's basically an agreement between the wedding professional and the client that we're going to forego the breach of contract, having to chase people for money in courts situation. But we talked about earlier how it's almost never at the end of the day, cost benefit, from a cost benefit analysis, worth the lawsuit. So the liquidated damages clause is acting as the agreement between the parties to say, listen, if you breach, if this mechanism is triggered, I'm keeping this money as a reasonable damage to me because you breached, and everybody's square. That's kind of how it works. So sum up, liquidated damages is you want to make sure that the mechanism for when the money goes back, if it does, if the client cancels for the reason that you specify, why it doesn't go back, and that it's essentially the trade-off of the parties are making, rather than suing each other to prove whatever damages you think that you're owed. You're just saying that money that I have is reasonable damages because you breached that contract.
Whoa, that is a good clause we need to put into our agreement. I don't even know if we have that.
We gotta look.
Yeah, geez. But I like how that was a really good description of what you were saying there and how you clarified that, just outlining, what it is and what's not going back to the client. Just so when it comes to the agreements, you just want to make things pretty clear on there as well, right? Not make it so, I guess, funky lawyer speak.
That's right. That's right. I mean, the you should be able to read. You should be able to read any contract you sign and not have any education beyond high school.
Yeah.
It should be written in such a way that you don't need to know all the Latin or anything like that. So hopefully your contracts are not scaring people away for that.
Mm-hmm.
But the age of all these heretofores and all that kind of stuff has been gone for many.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So I wanted to go into a little bit about LLCs and sole proprietorship. Which one do you feel is necessary for a wedding vendor to have to protect them against, situations in, lawsuits or whatever? Which one do you find is better? And is there a difference between the two?
Sure. Yes, there are differences between those. So just from a 40,000 foot view, if a wedding professional just wakes up one day and is like, I want to be a calligrapher and do stationery, or I wake up and I want to be a videographer. If they literally wake up that morning with no, background in it and immediately like somehow they land a client without having done anything else,
mm-hmm.
then the law is likely, and again, this is state by state, but the law is likely going to assume that they're a sole proprietor. And what that means is that there is no difference. There is no difference between the owner, who is a sole proprietor, the person that just woke up and was like, I'm going to DJ a wedding,
mm-hmm.
and the business. It's one thing. So if the sole proprietor goes to the event and accidentally drops something on somebody's foot and, hurt somebody, the client, whoever is hurt, is going to sue the sole proprietor. And that means that because the sole proprietor, there's no difference between that person and the business, their assets are at risk. So any lawsuit or judgment can be satisfied by the personal assets of the sole proprietor. So, fast forward a few hundred years, now we have a point where it's like, okay, well, we want to be able to have businesses, more businesses. And we do that by incentivizing people to create them without having to risk their house to create that business. So we want to be able to shield the person's assets from the assets of the business if something goes wrong and they're sued. And so the first legal fiction, what we call that, the first legal fiction was the C Corp, corporation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the idea that the owners, the person that wake up out of that bed, is separate and apart from the actual business. And so a C Corp is its own thing under each state's laws. And it typically, it's a person that's a shareholder. They purchase shares within a company. In the wedding and the event industry, it's usually one person. They own 100% of the shares.
Yeah. And
in order to keep the legal fiction, you got to do things like have board meetings, have meetings of the board, have CEOs, these type of things. So that got to be too hard. It's like, hey man, I don't want to have shares. I don't want to have to worry about being on the SEC and the stock exchange. How can you make this easier? About 30 years ago, they go, okay, let's take the ease of being a sole proprietor, but the protection of a C Corp, and do something kind of in the middle, like that nice, porridge.
Yeah.
And that's the LLC. And so the LLC does the same thing where it's much, much easier to start, and it's much, much easier to run than a corporation. It's almost basically like being a sole proprietor. I mean, don't quote me on that, but it's almost as easy being a sole proprietor, but you get that protection of your assets versus the business assets. So that's the main idea behind liability, limiting liability to the corporation or the company versus being a sole proprietor. This does not mean that you have to be an LLC or you have to be a C Corp in order to have protection.
Mm-hmm.
I have many clients that are sole proprietors, but they protect their assets and they protect themselves from judgments by having substantial insurance that covers errors and omissions, so like breach of contract, or the liability where they accidentally drop somebody's foot.
Yeah.
So they do that for various reasons. Could be tax reasons, or the like. It probably is tax related. But in my experience, in almost every state, the easiest thing to do is to form an LLC because it's so inexpensive and it's such an easier thing to do, and it provides you that protection. So hopefully that didn't take too long to explain, but I wanted to, because you get lost in details, but that's pretty much the 40,000 foot view of what these things are compared to one.
No, I like that you're going into great detail with this, because this is great stuff.
Yeah, it makes it easier to understand.
Yeah, and I was going to ask too, like, the reason a sole proprietor would move to an LLC would be for that extra protection. Is that the main difference between the two of them right there?
That is the almost entire reason why you would want to do that. I mean, there are other reasons, like other than protection. So, for example, if you wanted to sell your business, it would be easier if it was an LLC versus a sole proprietorship. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then there are other reasons between an LLC and a corporation. Like, if you want to take on capital, it might be easier as a corporation versus an LLC. But this is for your tax person and your CPA to decide. But these are the reasons why. I've got clients that call me and they're like, "Hey, I want to incorporate in Delaware." It's like, why? Because you heard that somewhere. In reality, until you get your first 7 figures, I wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah, no kidding. So say someone is a sole proprietor and they've been in the industry for 3 years now, and they're thinking about becoming an LLC. When would they want to transfer that? And because I know some people are sole proprietors and then they want to go to LLC.
Does it matter what time of year?
Yeah, does it really matter? And yeah, exactly.
In my experience, I'm not a tax person, but and I would say that one of the main reasons to go from sole proprietorship to the LLC would be for tax reasons if you already have a whole bunch of insurance. But if you don't want to pay for a whole bunch of insurance, and again, you might do something and you think that you're covered by your insurance company, and they bolt. In fact, that's what's going on right now with a lot of insurance coverage with the pandemic.
Wow.
Even though the pandemic might be in their rider, in the policy, they're not paying out. And in that case, the plaintiff in the case doesn't care that you don't have insurance, and they're coming after you, and so your assets are still at risk.
Mm-hmm.
You can sidestep that, sleep at night by having an LLC. So I guess at the end of the day, when should I go from sole proprietor to LLC? I mean, if you don't have insurance, I would advise it. If you want to talk to your CPA and make that decision, but there's no bright line rules of when you should do that.
Okay, awesome.
That I know.
Yeah. Awesome. So I kind of have a 2-part question, something that I've just always been curious on, because some contracts I've seen have the business owner signing the contract as well, and some have just one part of the party, like the bride, sign the contract. Some have both of them signing them. So is there one better way to do it? Is it necessary for the business owner to sign the contract, or just the couple, and better to have both the bride and groom, or bride and bride, or groom and groom, whatever it is?
Parents, or even parents that just sign it? Huh?
Yeah. Or just one of them. What's your input on that?
Okay. That's a really excellent question. I don't think I've gotten the countersign question in a while. So let's do this. I'll take it one at a time. Okay. The first kind of question was, does the vendor have to sign? So what we will call that would be a countersign, essentially. So you typically don't need to do that. If you are the vendor and you have your contract and the contract isn't going to be changed, typically you don't have to sign it back. You don't have to countersign it, because it's kind of acting as the offer. And if the client signs it, the client is accepting the offer. You don't need to accept their acceptance, if that makes sense. It's like any other contract that you've ever signed, like your cell phone contract, all that stuff. They're not signing it. Yeah. They gave it to you. You can take it or leave it. It's safe if there have been revisions to it, but 99.9% of the time it's not. You hand it to them and they sign it, and that's it. if it goes to trial, the only reason why it would be important if you signed it is if you were claiming that you didn't do it with them, which will never be the case.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's possible, but that's what your countersign will be protecting you from, is somebody making the claim that they have a contract with you, and you're like, well, no, it's not even signed. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. And then the other part of this, what are the legal ramifications of the mom signing it versus the couple,
mm-hmm.
this type of thing, who all needs to sign it. I go into extreme depth on this in this week's episode of my own podcast.
Nice.
But just for the sake of brevity here, we'll refer to the parent, mom or dad, whoever's supplying the money, as the money person.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll refer to the couple as the recipient.
Okay.
So when just the money person signs your contract, typically that's the person you need to listen to. That's your client,
mm-hmm.
because they're the money person that signed the contract, and no one else. That's the person you listen to. If you breach the contract or they breach the contract, that's who you're suing, or you can be sued. The recipients, don't have anything to do with it.
Yeah.
There's an unfortunate quirk in the law where if the money person only has signed and the money person wants to sue you, the recipients can also sue you as well. It's called third-party beneficiary. So that's an unfortunate situation where even though the recipients haven't signed, they can still sue you, but you cannot sue them, only the money person.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the situation where you have the money person and the recipients all sign. In that situation, all three can sue you, but you can sue all three of them back. What are the advantages or disadvantages of doing any of those things? Typically, if you have to sue for money, you can only sue the person that has signed the contract. So that's something to consider. There's a flip side of that where it's like, if everybody's signing it or just the money person that's signed, who do I listen to when there's a disagreement about what color the flower should be? The answer to that is, again, you can either just have the recipient sign, if that's the person, but the easiest thing to do, and you can have whoever you want sign it, is in the contract itself, assign a point of contact. So it's a clause that would just be like, look, I don't care if 150 people sign this, if the whole family signs this contract, you are going to designate somebody that has final approval. And that's the only person I care about.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot of legal talk there. Man.
No, that's great though. Thank you so much for clarifying that.
Would that go into the same thing for cancellations? So for example, say that the bride cancels their wedding, but yet the parents want to sign the cancellation amendment. Would the bride need to still sign it if she originally signed the agreement form? Or does that matter?
Well, it's like this. So if I understand your question correctly, you have a contract for a wedding with the money person.
Uh-huh.
The recipient cancels the wedding. So then the wedding is not going forward as you had with the money person. The question is, do I have some type of cancellation form? Who signs that?
Yeah.
Number one is, typically a cancellation form is not required for you in terms of your legal rights to the original contract.
Okay.
You have whatever rights you want outlined in the original contract. So if it's a matter of keeping money or whatever, that's fine. What the cancellation contracts that I've seen are doing, there are a few things that they can do. One, it just establishes that the client canceled. So they can't come back and go like, I never told you I canceled the wedding. You know what I'm saying? Like, well, you told me you did, right? The other thing it can do is it just releases, you can be a release of liability.
Yeah.
And it can also establish, I guess, in more detail, the liquidated damages portion of the contract. So you can go into detail like, okay, well, my contract says this, but at the end of the day, we're going to agree that in this cancellation agreement that I'm going to keep this or give back this, or you're going to give me this or whatever. Those are kind of the things that the cancellation agreement can do. So who signs that?
Yeah.
I guess at the end of the day, it's probably preferred that if it was the money person that signed originally, the money person is going to be the one that signs the addendum or the amendment or the cancel, whatever you're calling it, the cancellation document.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably the safest. But I think at the end of the day, it's not going to matter. But the issue is that if they breach the cancellation agreement, you're only going to be able to go after the person that signed that agreement.
Yeah. That's good. So so like a cancellation form, since you said it's not really necessary, but it's just a nice little safety cushion to have. So like you said, they can't be like, I never said we canceled our wedding, or I never said, we're not doing it, whatnot.
That's right. So I guess from a 40,000 foot view, we'll go really, really broad again. All a contract is an exchange of promises.
Yeah.
I promise to give you $500. You promise to do day of coordination. It's two people agreeing to do things that they wouldn't normally have to do. I wouldn't normally have to give you $500. I wouldn't normally have to coordinate your wedding. Then there comes the issue with the wedding is canceled, and therefore one of the parties is probably in breach. They have breached one of those promises. Okay, what the following everything to the legal conclusion, the aggrieved party can sue for breach of contract, and they would be entitled to X amount of money. So what that cancellation agreement can do is, okay, we are going to form a new agreement. We're going to form a new set of promises that we didn't have to do already. And part of that is going to be cleaning up the mess of the breach.
Mm-hmm.
So everything that might have been wrong with the original contract that the client did, we are taking care of that in this new agreement between each other. So that's kind of what in my experience, I mean, some attorneys do the cancellation things differently. But at any rate, that's what it is. It's a new set of promises that kind of swallows up the old contract, if you will.
Awesome. Thank you for clearing that up. Yeah, that's nice.
I had a question kind of along that. I don't know if it is, but anyways, can changes or additions to a contract, like say they want to add on another service or something small, can any changes be made legally by email, or should the entire contract be rewritten or re-signed just to save yourself?
Yeah. Like for example, say they sign an agreement form, but then say like a month later, they're like, oh, we want to add on this service. Do you have to create a whole new contract for that?
Okay, good question. So I think I heard in there, can an amendment be done by an email, or can, a month later after you sign a contract and they want something else, do you have to do it? This type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes to all those things.
Okay.
So can you amend a contract through an email? You can amend a contract through, blinks. You can amend a contract through smoke signals. As long as there is a mutual understanding and a mutual exchange of new promises, you can do whatever you want. That can be text, phone call, opening up your window and yelling, whatever you want, as long as there's the mutual thing.
Okay.
Now, again, to be safe, you want it rendered to a writing.
Yeah.
Okay. So, like, often things get changed, with a phone call. But you want to follow back up with these things with a writing. Now, the question is, Rob, does it have to be a whole new contract? No, it doesn't. Cool. You can amend a contract with 2 sentences in an email, with 5 words in a text. What will happen is that whatever additions or amendments or changes that you make to the original contract, they're going to ride along with the contract.
Okay.
So typically how it would work is if, like, let's just say, for example, that you are, we have not touched on yet, you say you're a wedding florist, and you get $1,000 contract for 12 roses. They email you and go, I want two more roses.
Mm-hmm.
That's an offer. I'm making an offer to you, and you can say, okay, I'll give you 2 more roses, but it's going to cost you another $100.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you email back or text back or whatever, you've amended that contract. Now, what's going to happen is that now the contract is exactly as it was. Everybody is still on board with everything that the original contract said, except now you scratch out a dozen roses, put 14 because you wanted 2 more, and then the price. But the only thing that's different now is what was amended. Everything else is the same. So that's why I'm saying you don't have to sign an entirely new agreement, because the amendment rides with the original to the extent the amendment conflicts with anything in the original, the amendment will listen to.
Okay.
Nice, man. This is some great information here.
Stuff I've always been curious on.
Yeah, I love this. Well, while we let our brains soak in this information, we're going to take a quick little break.
Welcome back, guys. We're still here with Rob from Wedding Industry Law.
What's going on, Rob? So we wanted to get more into COVID-19 right now with the whole pandemic situation. I've seen a lot of vendors going frantic about what to include into their contracts and how to be protected in this situation. So we wanted to dig into your brain and see what you think about this.
Yeah, so we've all been dealing with postponements left and right. Spring couples are postponing to later this year or next year. And I've heard some vendors are resending contracts with the new date. Some are sending addendums, amendments, whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Some are just like updating invoice due dates, and others are just like changing the dates on their calendars. So I was curious, how do you recommend making a new postponed wedding date official in order to best protect both your business and the couple?
Mm-hmm.
Great question. So if I understand correctly, we have a role professional. We have an event that is postponed or will be postponed, and the client wants to postpone it. It's not the client is saying, I'm out of here. They want to postpone it. Uh-huh. What can you do in that? What should you do in that situation? I think that right now, the main thing to do is exactly as we talked about before we went to the break. You would be amending your contract, and which is a good thing if the client's on board. So the number one thing is to make sure that whatever the document that you have, it's the amendment, it's the alteration, the addition, or whatever it is, outlines the new date, outlines the agreement between the parties with regard to if there are any additional charges. So, for example, I helped the florist today with the same concept, because the flowers as they are, the value of the flowers now are not going to be the same as they are next November.
Exactly.
It's going to be more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So understanding that whatever charges that you're agreeing to with the client because of the postponement. I think that probably really important right now, and it's going to be important until there's a vaccine, is having a force majeure clause in the addendum mm-hmm. for the rescheduled event. So let's kind of dive into that a little bit.
Yeah.
The force majeure clause is a clause in the contract that essentially says we are going to discharge and waive anybody's liability if a act of God or specified event happens such that we can't move forward mm-hmm. with the event. So it prevents everybody from suing each other for breach of contract or not wanting to show up in the middle of an event. Now, not every force majeure not every force majeure clause is written the same. A good force majeure clause is going to provide that the client need to make reasonable steps to continue with the contract at such time as the force majeure event has expired. So what that means in wedding and event industry land is that the clients will work to reschedule the event within a specified time. So in the next year, we'll attempt to reschedule the next 9 months, 18 months, whatever the case may be. I would highly recommend that is in the force majeure clause. We will take reasonable steps, reasonable efforts to rebook. The next thing is what I would refer to as shifting or assigning the risk of the force majeure event. Now, depending on what state you're in, the concept of force majeure is such that if you can't rebook, if the event is rendered completely impractical, like we can't go forward because of the force majeure event, typically everybody has to go back to square one. Money has to go back if it was paid to the vendor, and everybody goes back to square one. In some jurisdictions, it might be okay to keep expenses that you might have gone out of pocket for, and some it might not be, but who knows? Mm-hmm. But in your addendum that you're making now moving forward, you need to make sure that the client is agreeing to shoulder some of the loss if you cannot reschedule. Some states, it might be harder than others. A recommendation, if you don't want to have to eat costs, if you cannot rebook the date from a force majeure event, is to clarify that the client is assuming the risk of the loss of money that has been paid if you can't rebook after reasonable efforts, and they're encouraged to make efforts in light of that. So, for example, buying a cancellation policy, wedding insurance, or wedding insurance with cancellation policy. Something along those lines that the client is recognizing that the risk of ruin is falling to them and not the vendor, or equally, or somewhere in between. It doesn't have to be that way. You can be like, okay, well, if we can't rebook after reasonable efforts, client will be responsible for X amount. Doesn't matter. As long as that's spelled out, if you cannot rebook the date or the client does not want to rebook the date. So that's number two. The next thing is, and this would, and I don't know, like this wasn't quite as important to me until about a week ago. And I'm in Georgia now. I mean, I don't know, like our governor is opening everything up on Friday. But this was not quite as important as it was a few weeks ago, because if you want to make sure that, and I'll get to the point here, so I feel sputtering out, but the idea is this: the force majeure clause that you're going to put in this addendum needs to spell out what a pandemic is. So, first of all, many force majeure clauses don't have pandemic in it, and we can argue about whether or not that means that it's a force majeure event. Some attorneys argue it doesn't. I argue that it does, because this is an unprecedented time. Yeah. And the idea of a force majeure event is one that renders the ability to go forward with it impossible. And it's impossible to do it if you are going to be jailed if you have a gathering of more than 100 people. Mm-hmm. So now, understanding that, we're going to put the pandemic in the force majeure clause now. But it still needs to be defined. And again, I'm getting back to this, why it's so important now. It's because shelter in place makes sense. Mm-hmm. Proclamations from the mayor or from the governor that say you can't have a gathering of more than 100 people, that makes sense. And that's a force majeure event, and that can be a good definition of when a pandemic rises to the level of a force majeure event. Now, though, I'm seeing, like, I think the Air Force Academy graduated, which was a public event, but everybody had to be 8 feet apart, right? And I think that's what's going to happen. I think that there's going to be confusing laws that say that you can have a public gathering, but everybody's got to wear a mask. Everybody's got to be 8 feet apart from each other. And that makes a wedding useless.
Yeah, it does.
So you need to make sure that you keep these things in mind when defining what a pandemic is, because a wedding professional might go, yeah, I'll come take your pictures and wear my mask, and everybody's got to be 8 feet apart. It doesn't matter to me. But the client's like, no, dude, like, I can't. That's not right. Like, that's not an event. So the force majeure clause should be triggered. So you need to have an idea of what a pandemic is in the contract. And then I think, what is it? Yeah, I mentioned that. So those are some important things that you should have in whatever addendum that you're signing with the client.
That is really good to think about. And that's huge what you're pointing out. And that does seem like the direction it's kind of heading, which is sad to think about, kind of depressing for the wedding industry.
You're going to have to address these issues with your clients until there's a vaccine. Like, because I mean, like it could happen. It could happen at any time. And that's another thing that I forgot to mention too, is that when you're defining pandemic, the problem that some people are running into are the fact that even if pandemic is a force majeure event in their contract, like what happens in the theoretical world if, let's say that you have a wedding that's on May 1st, or let's just say May 15th. Let's say we have a wedding on May 15th right now. In your state or your local government says our shelter in place will be lifted on May 10th.
Mm-hmm.
So the shelter in place is lifted May 10th, meaning the quote unquote pandemic situation will no longer be in effect because for the wedding, which is on May 15th. You know, with me?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's still crappy because you can't do walkthroughs before. Yep. You can't, you couldn't go to the store to get stuff to, I don't know, like you couldn't go to your photography store to buy, batteries or whatever because it's not essential.
Mm-hmm.
So that still, you got to consider that with regard to whether or not, when you're defining what a pandemic situation is. Like, okay, well, we're going to say then that if there's a shelter in place or any type of law where you can't be within 6 feet or whatever the case may be, at any time within however many days of the event, even if it's set to expire prior to the event. So that's something that I forgot to mention that would be super important.
Yeah, that's really important. I didn't even think about that. So like basically anything that's prevented you from doing your job 100%, you should like really specify that in that force majeure pandemic thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's insane. Another thing I was curious about that force majeure thing is that sometimes I've heard some vendors saying that they don't know about putting it in because sometimes it's saying that the client is like, can get a full refund in anything during, an act of God or the pandemic or whatever. Is that true? Or is that just something that I hear whispering in the air?
Right. So again, this is going to be something that is state to state. Okay. So I can't give you specifics about what happens in Wyoming versus Maine or Maryland.
Yeah.
But just because you don't have that in your contract, doesn't mean that some of those protections aren't there. So taking it to the legal conclusion, if there is no force majeure clause, okay, and we have a contract, if you are saying to the client, I'm going to show up with my video camera, my camera, my flowers, whatever the case may be, even though there's a pandemic, I'm telling you that I'm doing that. And the client's saying, if you do that, you're going to be in a room by yourself. Taking it to its legal conclusion is that the photographer or the wedding professional will have to sue the client for breach of contract. And the client is going to have a defense to breach of contract called the doctrine of impossibility or the doctrine of impracticability or some other similar doctrine depending on what picture. And the judge is going to go, wedding vendor, you're out of your mind. I'm not giving you any money because this contract is void for this doctrine of impossibility. So it's kind of 6 of one, a half dozen of the other. It's just better to have the force majeure because it sets out the parameters of how to address the issue if there is such an event. Now, with regard to what money goes back, I promise that no judge is going to be sympathetic to a vendor keeping deposits that were designed, as I mentioned before, for when the client is in control of the event being canceled. Yeah. I promise. I don't know what state the person's in saying this. Even if they're in a state where I know that they might be able to be entitled to something back, if that goes through with a lawsuit, then they're going to be toast.
Yeah.
This is a situation where everybody has to act reasonable, client and professional.
Interesting. This is Man, my brain is like swirling over here.
Wait, so did you say that the judge would give the money back to the client then in that case?
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying that the idea of keeping money or whatever percentage of contract value, where the contract is saying, I'm keeping this money if the client cancels, would not apply to a situation where the client cancels because of something beyond the client's control. Now, that's under different principles in different states, but I'm just saying that following it to its logical conclusion with the judge sitting there, it's not going to be sympathetic, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Even if you have a force majeure that's like well written for it, or is that if you don't have it?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I missed that. That was a question. I'm sorry.
Go for it.
Like, is that if you don't have a force majeure clause in place that's like set up for the pandemic, or is that without it?
That's if you don't have one.
Oh, okay.
Like, I mean, again, like, so like if the only way that anybody's going to know who owes anybody what is if it goes through a lawsuit.
Okay.
Gotcha.
That's why I'm saying it's better for everybody to act reasonably with regard to giving money back or holding on to money. So I've talked to wedding professionals that are wanting to hold almost 100% of the contract value back. And it's like, that doesn't represent out-of-pocket expenses or whatever. It's like, well, I got to keep my lights on. It's like, well, that's a completely different thing. Like, it's a hard situation we're in, but, you know, it's going to be difficult for you when you get up to a certain percentage of the contract value if you're wanting to keep it.
Yeah.
For the judge to have to people.
Makes sense. So I want to get into the retainers now, because I've seen a lot of vendors having to deal with, you know, brides and couples that have had to cancel their weddings due to this whole situation. And they've been looking like the vendors have been looking like the bad guys for having, you know, that non-refundable retainer deposit. And, you know, I've seen them where they're trying to like cool the bride down in a way, trying to say like, hey, look, I understand your situation, but the retainer is non-refundable. How does a vendor, you know, protect themselves in this situation with the whole refund deposit thing and kind of cool down the bride?
Right. So when I was talking about liquidated damages before, that's the non-refundable retainer. It's that you don't have to use the words liquidated damages for it to be functioning that way under the law. Okay. Any money that you're saying you're going to keep if X event happens, that's liquidated damages, because that's what you're saying is I'm going to be made whole, or not made whole, but I'll be okay keeping this money if X happens.
Okay.
In almost all contracts, that X is not a force majeure event.
Okay. That makes sense.
Because that is outside of the control of the parties. So to the extent that somebody wants to hold their contract and go, well, my deposit or my retainer is non-refundable. I mean, again, it depends on what state you're in. But typically a trial judge is going to go, this is outside of that realm. This is an event that's happening that's impossible because of a law that's saying that you can't have gatherings. That's not the same. You would be made. It would be not immoral is not the word, but it would be unfair for the client to get nothing, and you hold on to that whole. You would hold on to a amount of money that does not represent something with regard to expenses.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So with that clause, I remember you mentioned it before for the retainer. So say it's non-refundable. It says that in your agreement. Do you still have to kind of like outline why it's not refundable? Like saying, I put in X amount of time, I'm blocking out your date due to you having it and me missing out with other opportunities with other businesses, other couples, or can you just keep it as non-refundable as when you sign the contract?
Well, if I understand correctly, the question. So most of the time that people in the event industry are using the word deposit or retainer that's non-refundable, that's the liquidated damage.
Oh, okay.
So if you want that to be like tip top, if forcible, you would need to put the information in that I have outlined at the beginning of the episode.
Okay.
So the mechanism, the why, and how it makes you whole if the event is canceled for whatever mechanism you've decided. What I'm saying is that most of your contracts, the non-refundable deposit, retainer, whatever you call it, installment payment, falls outside of the COVID-19 realm.
Yeah. Makes sense.
I was curious too. Is it better to use the word like retainer fee over deposit, or does it matter at all?
Another shameless plug for my podcast. I have a whole episode dedicated to this exact question.
Nice.
But the long and short of it is, as long as you explain to the client the mechanism, the why, and the why it's reasonable for you, it really doesn't matter what you call it. I lay out in my podcast about how I don't use either one of those terms.
Oh, interesting.
Because there's baggage that comes along with it.
Whoa.
In terms of client expectations and then the expectations of a possible trial judge. In the contracts that I draft, I typically don't use either of those.
Interesting.
What would be the better word?
You can use installment payment.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
But,
installment, yeah.
But again, there's not a magic word.
Yeah.
What's important is what comes after the word.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We'll have to listen to that podcast episode.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to check out all your episodes on there, going deep into more about this stuff. So are there any wedding vendors, are wedding vendors ever entitled to more than a deposit if the event is canceled?
Excellent question. That's actually something that I often leave off, which is why you should always get legal counsel and not rely on podcasts like me.
Yeah.
Do going forward stuff. But okay. So as I mentioned before, most of the time when in your contracts, and again, I haven't read everybody's contracts, but typically the law is going to understand your non-refundable retainer or deposit or whatever you call it as the liquidated damages clause. And again, that is the agreement between the parties that I'm going to keep this money if you cancel for whatever the reason is that you've outlined. And that means that you're not entitled to more because you're agreeing that this is what's going to make me okay if you cancel for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not fair to say, I'm going to be able to keep this, but I'm going to have to go after you for more. In a typical breach of contract lawsuit, you have to prove damage and prove what damages you're entitled to. And that will be actually the podcast episode next week. But what you're entitled to do, what you're entitled in a breach of contract action or client canceling is to be put in a position that you would have been had the contract gone forward. And so that can be kind of a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why the liquidated damages clause is awesome, is because you're saying with the client, I'm not going to sit here and try to prove to you that I didn't take other opportunities. I'm not going to sit here and try to prove to you that I went out of pocket for an assistant. We're just going to agree that this amount of money that I already have in my hand satisfies the damages that I would be entitled to if I sued you for breach of contract. And so therefore, in the law of liquidated damages in most states, that's final. You can't sue for more.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah, very good to know. That's crazy. So I had one last question. So moving forward with this whole pandemic and, as this whole wedding industry now starts to get a little weirder, is there anything that you feel that wedding vendors should be adding to their contracts moving forward to protect them, maybe against anything besides
beyond what we mentioned?
I think that, as I outlined, and you want to beef up the force majeure clause and the assignment of what happens if you can't revoke. That's the number one thing. Until there's a vaccine, you have to have that in there. But once there's a vaccine, you can kind of remove that because, again, your contract should be, the most space to be dedicated to things that are more likely to happen. And so, if your force majeure event clause is, 4 pages, it's, what are the chances that there's going to be, another COVID-19 or whatever? But anyway, I think that just making sure that you have a strong liquidated damages clause, which again is either your non-refundable deposit return or whatever. Make sure that's beefed up. Making sure your force majeure clause is beefed up from now on. I think that those are the two, for the next 18 months, those are going to be the two main things that you're going to be doing.
Interesting. I had another question too. I saw an article where someone had a wedding and I guess like everyone there got pretty much infected with this COVID-19 and the couple sued the venue. So moving forward, how would like of the vendors kind of protect themselves from that? So say like in maybe, summertime, they allow weddings to happen, but in small groups, but then someone gets infected and then they try to sue the vendors and the wedding venue. How could we protect ourselves from possible situations like that?
So it would be, I think, if I understand correctly, an attendee to a wedding sues the vendor because they contract COVID-19.
Yeah, something like that. Like, cause like the bridegroom or an attendee just sues out the vendors and the venue. I saw an article where they try to sue the venue due to some people getting sick.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I would assume if you're the venue operator that if you are operating within the law in terms of shelter in place, that's a step towards, you wouldn't be liable in that situation.
Yeah.
If you're a venue now, I think that you should probably have, at this point, develop a policies and procedures with regard to infection control if you don't already have one. So, for example, make sure that it's posted somewhere that if you have any W-2 employees that are washing their hands, that things are clean. Any independent contractors or wedding vendors that are operating in the venue, they need to wash their hands, have those policies and procedures up, and that would help to relieve any potential liability with regard to the venue. With regard to anyone else, any other vendor, I would see that the only time that I think that you would be liable for that maybe is if you didn't take reasonable steps if you had it. Like if you knew that you had it or you knew you were showing symptoms and still showed up, then it's possible that you could be sued for that. I don't know how at the end of the day that would be proven.
Yeah.
But I think that the only way that you're going to, I guess this gets to what we talked about at the top of the episode. Like the best thing that you can do is have the appropriate insurance and the appropriate corporate liability shelves around you to protect your assets. I think that'd be the most important.
Definitely agree. It was just a little question bubbling in my brain and I heard about, so I just wanted to see what were your thoughts about this. So Rob, this has been great. I know this information is really going to help out a lot of vendors and I'm definitely going to be tuning into your episodes a lot more. And I'll share out your stuff for sure, because vendors need to know. This is really good. So where can people, I know you have your podcast, but where else can people find you?
So I am, you can check out my website, which is weddingindustrylaw.com. That's got a lot of blogs from the past 10 years or so, dealing with a lot of different wedding and event issues. Any questions, shoot me an email, rob@weddingindustrylaw.com. And then if you're interested in templates, it's wedforms.com, wedforms.com. And then the podcast is everywhere you get podcasts, and it's also on YouTube. So, and if anybody listening, if you enjoy this content, if you could subscribe to the YouTube channel, because it's so strange. The rule on YouTube is that you can't go live from your phone until you have 1,000 subscribers. And I have like 12. Wow. So I'm trying to grow that because I want to be able to do it on the go.
Yeah, definitely. I'll definitely describe that. You too, Jade.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, we'll subscribe. You got 2 right there. So we'll definitely get this. Yeah, no worries. So yeah, we'll get that information. We'll put this, your links in the show notes, as well as, do you have an Instagram too?
Yeah, the Instagram is a wedding lawyer.
Okay, cool. So we'll put that all in the description for people to check out. Hey, Rob, thank you again for being a part of our show. We've gained a lot of information here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. And
you're very welcome. Thank you guys for having me. Hopefully it's good for your audience. But I appreciate you guys reaching out to me.
Man, Rob was awesome. He definitely provided us a lot of great tips and valuable information when it comes to our agreement forms.
Yeah, I'm still digesting all of that information. It was so nice, though, just to get some clarity on things that I've always been curious about.
For sure. Also, if you'd like to learn more information about this topic, check out his podcast called Wedding Industry Law. As always, guys, thanks again for tuning in to the Wedding Vendors Happy Hour. Till then, we'll catch you on episode number 11.